Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Beth. And Seattle chapter, thank you for the opportunity. We're excited to speak on this. So what I'll do is introduce myself, and we're all three speaking. And so the next speaker will be Dr. Vivian, and so she'll introduce herself, and then Summer, and then go back to me, and I'll get it started. And I am in Charlotte, North Carolina, and my wife and I are the parents of a brand new 1.5-year-old, and so it is past our bedtime, and I am crashing. So after I give my portion of the presentation, I'm going to head out. And if you have any questions for me, then use the contact information to email me. I'd be happy to. I do love discussing it, but my brain is shutting down and saying, go to bed. So again, my name is Tim, Charlotte, North Carolina. My business is Simplify with Tim. I'm a life coach and professional organizer. And I discovered through professional organizing, I've been working with a lot of ADHDers, diagnosed or just really symptomatic. And a lot of the skills that I've shared with them are because I've managed my own symptoms and been able to help them. And so, yeah, got my PCAC from PAC. You may know PAC. And also my ACC from ICF just this past year. And it's been a kind of 4-year journey. And I've studied alongside Summer. That's who I met. And I'll hand it off to Summer to talk about herself and her business. You there, Summer?
You handing it off to me? Okay. Yeah. So
Can you see the screen? Okay, the slides.
Screen just fine.
Yes.
And there's a little background noise. Do you hear that? Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Summer. Thank you for being here. I am an ADHD coach. I'm also a former architect, and I have ADHD. So I know what it's like to be in a profession that requires both a lot of creativity and a whole lot of executive functioning, and how much that can be a challenge for people, people with ADHD and people who identify as creative. So now my focus is on helping other scattered creative professionals get what's important done with enough time to enjoy their life. And you can find me at scatteredcreatives.com. Vivian will get us started.
Okay, so this is a slide on Tim, but he just mentioned his credentials and his life situation in case you wanted to jot down his website. And then this one is about me. So I was a neuroscientist for a good 15 years and did a lot of research on brain networks that are actually impacted by ADHD. And at the very end of my career, I studied how mindfulness works in the brain. So I'm very interested in that. And I was so interested in that and had my personal experiences with the benefits of meditation and other mindfulness practices that I decided to change my career focus to helping people develop their mindfulness practices. So I created a program called Kind Mind here in Santa Barbara, where I live. And now I go into schools and museums and botanical gardens and wherever I can get my hands on people. And I try to teach them how to be mindful, compassionate, connect to nature, because I believe those are very healthy mental states to have. And I also have 2 teenage daughters. One of them was diagnosed with ADHD when she couldn't learn how to read. And then my second one just got diagnosed more recently. And so I'm navigating the whole landscape of ADHD through them and learning about myself as well in terms of what ADHD type symptoms I'm having. So it's been really, really fun for me to go back to my own research and read a bunch of other people's research on what we know about the brain now, now that there's been a lot of research done. And yeah, so I basically, I'm going to start giving the floor back to Tim, because he's going to start with the basic, very fundamental knowledge so that you guys can really get your heads around the neuroscience. And then I'll go into a little more depth after he goes.
Great. Thanks, Vivian. And Dr. Vivian is going to be very helpful and do the slides for me. this is how it kind of started, because we presented at the International ADHD Conference. And it just made life a whole lot better. So I just wanted to share that the impetus for what we're sharing today comes from largely Summer and I taking courses together and discovering that nobody really had a concise way of explaining ADHD to us. It remained this kind of vague description of executive function challenges. And it's like, can somebody just get to the basic science of what we know about it and explain it to me, and then let me come up with metaphors? Because all we would get is a bunch of metaphors and none of them linked up. And then you go to get your own information and TikTok gives you all kinds of junk and you're just confused, emotionally charged, overwhelmed. It's just like, let's get to it. And so we collaborated, and it's been about a 4-year journey of being really disciplined in our study and personal quest to understand it better. And we came up with ways to explain and help people see ADHD at a neurobiological level, and to explain it for all kinds of people, no matter your level of understanding, so that you can better grasp the realities of ADHD and how it may be impacting your life. And then on top of that, how you may want to navigate your life, knowing those challenges are in your life or in a friend's life or whatnot. So how do I like to start explaining ADHD to people so that we can understand it in a way that's more that puts us all in the boat together? I like working with families, getting everybody on the same boat with understanding ADHD. And I like to start with squirrels and brains, especially. So why, just think for yourselves, why do squirrels dig up in the yard and put tree nuts into the ground to eat during winter? That seems a lot of forethought there. Well, we understand actually it's majority instinct. They're driven to do it. However, why then does the human being, the Homo sapien, plant way more crop than is needed at harvest time, takes some to eat that night, takes some and stores it away, and then takes the rest and sells it, and then takes the proceeds from the money, puts some in the banking account, savings account, kids' college, retirement, and then goes out that night with the family with a little extra money and has a great debate between pistachio ice cream or mint chocolate chip. My wife chooses mint chocolate chip, which blows my mind because pistachio is the best. But the fact that we can make those complicated decisions shows a far more robust thinking capacity than all the other animals in the animal kingdom. We are going into space. We're building civilizations. We have language. So what's going on here? Well, if we compare the brains, we look at the brains, they're physiologically different. And you may think size matters, but elephant brains and whale brains are bigger than ours. So what's the difference? This phone I'm using for this presentation is a computer. Don't go to that slide just yet, sorry. The phone I'm using right now is a computer, and it is smaller than the original computers that were almost as big as a room and weighed as much as a car. And those had the computational capacity of like a book, enough information. The only information they could hold is like one book. The phones we have now are vastly smaller, but far more capable. What's the difference? Complexity. And if you compare the human brain with the rest of the animal kingdom brains, we find that the human brain is far more complex. Now, it's not in that very structured, computer type way. It has to do with a mushy biology. The ripples across the top of the brain, the prefrontal cortex in the human brain is particularly robust. The actual physical complexities of the human brain are uniquely different than the rest of the animals in the animal kingdom. Now, what is the brain doing when we're thinking? Okay, we get it. There's physiological complexities that are uniquely different compared to other animals. What is the brain doing, though? And we've all heard of the term executive function. We were talking about it before this even, and how we as humans have the ability, and I'm really taking executive functions down to a simple level for all peoples, not the psychological terms, but basically humans have the capacity to imagine a future, themselves in the future, understand where we are in relation to that future goal according to time, our resources, and what we need to do to get there, to break that up over pieces over many days, and then implement tasks and actions that gain us steps towards achieving that goal, the resources and the timing, and to be constantly aware of ourselves in space and time and action to know that we are working our way towards that goal. These are, a simple way of describing some of the unique things humans can do at a level the rest of the animals cannot and fit within the executive function understanding. And we have studied the human brain so much that we have taken humans, put them into brain scanners, MRI, fMRI machines, and watched the brain in action, have given humans tasks that require executive functioning, unique challenges that are task oriented, that humans have a unique grand capacity to do at complex levels the rest of the animals cannot. And we can watch the brain active and what it's doing. And we have seen in repeat cases, the human brain has specific regions active during the time of executive functioning. Now we can go to that slide. Here they are. We find these colored portions of the brain active, lighting up with activity when executive function is the requirement that the human is doing in that while they're in the scanner. You can see these names you probably remember from, biology back in high school: basal ganglia, prefrontal cortex, cerebellum. And they're all lighting up together with similar intensities of activity. It's almost like they're in harmony together. There's a flow of a flow from front to back and back to front, going back and forth. And there's a harmonious flow of intensity. The brain waves coming off the head, the theta waves, beta waves, that sort of thing. They're showing a, a common harmony amongst them. It's almost like an orchestra for our conscious mind to be functioning. And if there were a conductor, it would be the prefrontal cortex. So when executive function is required, these are the parts of the brain that are lighting up with activity when our human brains when we're implementing executive function activities. All right. Well, what about when the crops get, destroyed by a tornado? The farmer comes out and is furious, so angry, the farmer wants to throw up his hands, kick the rest of the barn over and say, I quit. But they don't. They calm down and get back to work. Well, there's another part of the human brain that's got to do with emotional control and impulsivity. Here it is. We've taken human beings, put them in an fMRI machine, royally pissed them off, and then watched the brain see what it does. I've been hiking to the edge of a cliff where I looked down and saw my death if I kept going. And I suddenly had the horrendous thought of, what if I kept going? What if I kept just leaning over? And a panic came up with it inside of me. I began to sweat. I even started to cry a little bit and stepped back. I had a serious vertigo challenge the rest of that week. But in that moment, I had a thought of going over the edge. These parts of the brain lit up with activity to make sure I don't do just anything I think. This is impulse control. This helped me manage my activity. This helps the farmer who blows up with fury at the destruction of the crops, but doesn't quit. Our brain engages different parts that work in concert together to help us execute emotional control, things to do with impulsivity. All right. Well, what about when, like, the human is bored? What about when the crops are growing, you're sitting around waiting on the crops, you don't have anything to do, executive function, you're not dealing with emotional control, you're bored, or you're standing in line at Starbucks, you got nothing to do. Well, we've taken human beings, put them in the scanner, and got them bored. And then as soon as their brain waves changed, we find that in this idle state of the mind, we call this the default mode network. These parts of the brain light up. Notice they're slightly different regions. And pulled the people out of the fMRI machines and said, hey, your brainwave activity changed. What were you thinking about just then? And usually people are thinking about one of two things: either that Paradise Island vacation they want to be going on, or when they win the lottery, what they're going to be doing, that exciting daydream, kingdom that they live in, or the negative side of daydreaming, the ruminating, where we doom dream. Oh my God, I was daydreaming about how I had said something that was rude to so and so yesterday, and we're friends. I'm afraid they're never going to call me again, and we're not going to see them again for years. And then our kids will never hang out, and we're going to lose opportunities for a better life, and my kids are going to be homeless. And we don't even have kids yet. This default mode network has also been called the demon network, just because of the amount of negative thoughts that can ruminate, occur during this doom dreaming time. But it can also be the fun, exciting, oh man, if I win the lottery, this is what I'm going to do. And then I would do this, and we're getting ourselves all excited. So this is called the default mode network. We can watch it light up with activity. And this is typically occurring when the brain is getting bored. Sits in the idle state, doesn't need to go to sleep. And the human brain does a lot more than all this. These are just some simple, basic, unique things we've been able to watch the human brain do, human consciousness in action in specific regions of the brain when it comes to specific things that we're doing. And when it comes to ADHD, these are very important to be aware of. Now, what do I mean, though, by the brain is lighting up? So the brain is made up of neurons, and the human body has a total of about almost 100 billion neurons, and most are in the brain. So that gray matter are all these little animal cells that are shaped like trees pulled up out of the ground, showing their roots. And they all link up, roots to branches, interconnecting. This is leading to trillions of connections. And there is an electrochemical signal occurring between neurons at those connections between roots and branches. And these electrochemical signals are occurring at the speeds measured in the thousandth of a second. That is how fast these electrical chemical signals are firing throughout our brain. And we're talking about in the numbers of trillions of connections. Now, what's even crazier is if you zoom in where these roots and branches connect, you see the zoom in, they're actually not touching. There's a gap there. Some of you have heard of it. It's called the synaptic gap. It's the synapse. And what's occurring is the roots of one neuron are releasing a specific ingredient packet of neurotransmitters to be received by the branches of the next neuron. I call these spices. It's like an ingredients list for a soup. And depending on what part of the brain is active and what you're thinking about will differentiate the ingredients list of the neurotransmitters in those synaptic gaps for thought process. And if you zoom out on the brain, this is occurring across trillions of synaptic gaps at any given time. And I call this the spice flow. And this spice flow is in harmony with that electrochemical signaling that we talked about earlier throughout the thought process, the intensity of the neurotransmitters, the amount of them, the ratio of what kinds. You've heard of some of these neurotransmitters: dopamine, serotonin, neuroepinephrine. There are almost 100 we know of. Those three are particularly pertinent to ADHD and humans in general. However, those are some of the specific names of the neurotransmitters that make up these spices. And their flowing, their proper flowing and reception by the branches of other neurons is the functionality of our brain lighting up with activity. Now, we have studied the human brain so much and done thousands, literally thousands of fMRI scans that we have now started to study the neurodiverse, including ADHDers. Is the brain different compared to the average human brain if you have ADHD? And the answer is yes. And here are the major ways that we see the differences. Number one, interestingly enough, and some of you may not be surprised to hear this, ADHDers are more often than not found in the default mode network, whether doom dreaming or fun dreaming. They're more often than not slipping into the default mode network. I know that's true for me. I daydream a horrendous amount of my life away. Secondly, speed of brain development. So usually on average, the adult human brain forms to maturity around the age of 25. My daughter is a year and a half. Her brain is still growing into the proper full adult brain that she'll have for the rest of her life around the age of 25. However, ADHDers, we are finding, don't get that maturity until about 30 years old. That's about a 30% growth development delay. And that delay goes back in time to childhood. This is why diagnosis for ADHD includes childhood questions. That 30% delay goes all the way back to as simple as that 16-year-old who's about to get keys to a car. If a neurobiologist looked at their brain only, they would, if this person has ADHD, they're going to see the developmental maturity of an 11-year-old. That's pretty eye-opening. Third, size of the brain. I specifically want to talk about the regions associated with executive function and emotional control. Turns out ADHD brains, on average, are lacking 3 to 5% gray matter in executive function and emotional control regions of the brain. So if you want to go back to those two slides, I think they come right after this. Boom. These regions that light up during executive function are on average in ADHDers lacking 3 to 5% of the gray matter the average brain does. Not only that, the structure looks different. When you look at these structures under a microscope, they look structurally different. There is more similarities often, like in the prefrontal cortex, between ADHD neural networking here, or how the neurons look structured in these regions, to somebody who has had sustained brain injuries. That is how the differences look. Not only that, so you can show the emotional control, these regions as well, the ones associated with impulsivity and emotional control, on average, are lacking 3 to 5% gray matter compared to average brains, and the structure looks different under a microscope. Finally, not only that, the last one is the spice flow dysregulation. There is an increased dysregulation of neurotransmitter flow for people with ADHD. Watching them under the fMRI scanner as the brain is actively doing things with executive function or emotional control, we are watching the lack of harmony. The neurotransmitters are either showing up too much or too little. The spice flow is not a same ingredients list throughout the process of thinking. The ultimate average result of this is that the ADHD brain on average is running on below average amounts of neurotransmitters compared to the average brain. Do you know how important neurotransmitters are? If we had a vacuum cleaner that sucked neurotransmitters out of our head, what would start to happen? Well, the brain would begin to shut down because it has to take its neurotransmitter spice flow availability and send it to the more important parts of the brain, such as the part that tells your heart to beat. That's correct. Your heart beats because neurotransmitters are flowing at each pulse, being told by the central nervous system to beat. Neurotransmitters are essential for your body to function, let alone for us to think, dream, executive function. And the brain has to manage what neurotransmitter energy is put where. And if we're in a drought all the time, then we are lacking the full capacity fuel we need for the proper spice flow. Now do we understand why, ADHD or number one in the park loves to ride their bicycle on the edge of a wall as fast as they can, and it brings them such exhilarating happiness with that adrenaline flow, even though in a half a second they will fall and bust their butts and break a tooth. Now do we know why ADHD or number two sits in class, and instead of focusing on a good grade for a good college course, for a good career path, and instead is daydreaming about being a unicorn king in Paradise World and not doing their math homework? Or they're daydreaming about getting themselves into a panic about how they said something wrong to a friend the other day, and they're worried their friend doesn't like them anymore, and they're working up a real panic. Or why you and I stand in Starbucks at line at Starbucks, and it is absolute torture to be bored and stand there. And we'd rather get out our phone, look at the news to get our anxiety up and scare the pants off of us. All of these factors I have found have been necessary to bring forward for people to understand, to realize ADHD is not some character issue. This is one of those hidden challenges people can't see. And it's right here. It's happening right here. Now, what can we do about it? That's what matters. I understand that now. All right. What can we do about it? And that's when I hand it off to Dr. Vivian, our neuroscientist, who's going to go into that. And I'm going to say goodnight to you all. I hate to miss it. I want time for the discussion, but I'm going to be no good. My neurotransmitter flow is just petering out. So thank you for your time.
Tim,
And,
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Appreciate you staying up late.
Absolutely. Reach out with questions. Y'all have a great night.
You bet. Take care.
Thanks, Tim. It's always fun to have Tim start because he puts me in a good mood. And, you know, when I'm in a good mood, I get more dopamine to my brains and then I can concentrate on what I'm trying to say. And can you guys all hear me okay? Good. Okay. So basically, as he was talking about these different brain areas, I realized that there's a interesting way to show what happens when you're in your executive function network. You're kind of like more on the side of your brain. And then when you get into your default mode network, it's kind of like in the middle. So like if you cut the head this way with a knife, it would be like more closer to those areas in the middle. So it's almost like, you know, you get distracted, you go zoop, back into the middle. And then when you're focusing, you're kind of like on the side of the brain because both of them are part of the prefrontal cortex, but they're just a different area of the prefrontal cortex. And it matters, you know, also how they're all interconnected with other areas. And so what I like to do with the rest of my time is to explain a little more about how these brain networks that are a little bit differently wired and maybe have weaker connections are related to how there's like less of that spice flow that he was talking about, that there's lower dopamine, lower neurotransmission. And then I also want to explain a little bit about how you can actually use those very brain networks that we're talking about to build them up. And so that tremendous possibility for neuroplasticity being there even in adulthood. When I started out as a neuroscientist way back when I was just working in a lab, that was like a long time ago. I'm older than it seems on Zoom. Let's see, like 30 years ago. Neuroplasticity really is just the place where children developing will grow new brain cells, but actually adults can grow new brain cells. Maybe it's like a slower rate, but the point is that there's ways to do it and there's ways to boost that neuroplasticity, which I'll talk about. And one of those kinds of ways to boost it is with the mindfulness. And so I'll talk a little bit about that and the benefits of that. But basically what I wanted to point out a little bit is to give you a little more in-depth understanding of how that lower dopamine in the brain, because dopamine is one of the main ones of those spices that Tim mentioned, how they work. So there's actually not just one kind of dopamine in the brain, there's several, but I'm just going to talk about two different pathways. There's actually, as you see this picture, there's the red pathway. Those are all these fibers that go into the prefrontal cortex that affect the executive functioning and emotional control. And then there's the blue fibers that you see. They go into the green area. That's the basal ganglia. That's a very different kind of profile of dopamine release. And it makes the difference because they actually have different time courses and it affects the brain differently. So, for example, in the prefrontal cortex, where you see the red, there's a slow time course. So once the dopamine is released, it stays around for a while, giving you that ability to pay attention for a length of time. So it's a very different kind of function. And I'll explain a little bit more about how they actually have a different effect on your ADHD. So in the basal ganglia, in the green part with the blue fibers, that's where the dopamine is has kind of a dysfunction, or like a the firing is a little bit different in ADHD, but it's not going to be something that you can help with dopamine boosting medication, for example, because the way it works is that it has to be very specific to what you're doing. So for that part of the brain, the basal ganglia is crucial for learning skills. So for example, you're trying to learn how to shoot a basket in a basketball. And when the first time you make that basket, then dopamine fires immediately. So it fires and then it clears. It doesn't stay around. And then eventually, as you're getting better and better at a task, dopamine fires actually in anticipation of having a successful throw, making that basket. So that kind of transfer from, the successful action to the actual action that you're doing is what really is the hallmark of learning. When your dopamine fires in anticipation of the reward that you're going to get something, then I can say that you fully learned how to throw that basket. So in ADHD, that kind of transfer from the time of the reward to the time of the action or the anticipation is just a little bit diminished, doesn't fully transfer. And so that might be part of the reason why maybe there's some learning difficulties with ADHD. But because the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because ADHD is so complex. Like, obviously, even in the name, there's all these different things, right? And only a small part of it has to do with this difficulty in skill learning, right? It's just one part of it, because then there's all these other functions of dopamine that has to do with attention that are different. But to stick to basal ganglia, you're still going to have other deficits because of the dopamine in that deep part of the brain that's shown in green. For example, when you get an opportunity to get an immediate reward, it's really difficult to say no because that dopamine spike is really big in ADHD. And so it really makes it harder to delay gratification and to think about what would happen if you waited. And then the hyperactivity symptoms are also related to those kind of dopamine functions that are in the basal ganglia, right? Now, in the one that people most talk about is really the dopamine function in the prefrontal cortex, because that's the one where once the dopamine is released, it kind of bathes that prefrontal cortex. And it gives you that boost for attention, to be able to learn rules, go for your goals, take actions to achieve your goals. That takes motivation and that ability to control your emotions and impulsivity. So when you take medication, that will like boost that signal so that you have more of an ability to use your prefrontal cortex in that more optimal way. And of course, there's other spices like Tim was talking about. There's lots of different ones, like, for example, norepinephrine, and that has to do with alertness and arousal. So one way to think of these neurotransmitters is that what we want is to be at an optimal level, right? In ADHD, with the inattention and drowsiness and boredom that might be experienced, you would be at a lower part of this curve. So this curve is representing the level of neurotransmitters. So if you're at the red dot, then you have lower levels, right? And what you want to be is right there at the top of the hill, but you don't want to have too much, because if you slide down the hill to that yellow part, now you have too much of the neurotransmitters, and that can cause other kinds of symptoms, like, for example, anxiety. So what you want is that Goldilocks of not too much, but not too little. So as we know, we have a lower amount of dopamine when we have ADHD. So that's part of the reasons why medication can help. But I wanted to tell you guys that there's other ways, and I'm sure a lot of you guys already know that there are other ways to boost dopamines that is can be intentional. So why is it important to boost your dopamine? Well, obviously, so you can pay attention, but it's also something that's a requisite to neuroplasticity. So once you have dopamine around, you can engage in an activity that you want, and you can also learn better. So when you, and when you're able to use these networks of attention, the executive functions, then you strengthen them. Each time you use them, you can grow new connections in the brain. So you can literally change your brain with neuroplasticity, and it does require dopamine. But the good news is that there's a lot of different things you can do, like these life hacks that can get you that dopamine boost. And that can be something that's something quick, or something that might be a lifestyle type thing where you just have to repeat a certain habit or get into a good place with your lifestyle so that you can have a higher amount of neurotransmitters in general. Or you could just say, okay, I'm just going to put myself in a situation where I get that boost. So those would be like the enriched environments. So for example, playful physical activities will boost your dopamine. And that could be something that you enjoy, because obviously if you are motivated and interested in something, your dopamine levels will go up. A lot of ADHDers seem to like new situations, new environments, and it's probably because novelty boosts your dopamine. And another thing that's interesting, and a lot of people I've talked to are pretty creative when they are dealing with ADHD, but when they do let themselves engage in a creative activity, they actually have a dopamine boost. And the same thing with positive social interactions. So like if you have a new friend that you're getting to know, it'll boost your dopamine. Or if you're deepening a relationship that you have, dopamine, right? So what I'm suggesting is that you already like those activities that you like, but to pair those activities that are dopamine boosting and do it right before, but really timing wise, immediately before you have to go and do something boring, do something that you might be putting off, but something that has to get done that you need a lot of executive functions for. Maybe you have to study, maybe you just have to go into that lecture and pay attention to somebody, talk a lot, and you're better off doing that after you did something like this. And then the other side of things is to have a regular healthy habit of physical exercise, good sleep, having the kind of nutrition, which Beth was saying that you guys are going to have a talk on nutrition. So that's great. But that's kind of the whole point, is to make sure that your life includes all of those things that can really help that dopamine boost that will benefit you. And one of these things is mindfulness meditation, and also compassion practices. Now, we all feel compassion at many parts and times in our lives, but we can actually intentionally learn compassion practices. Some of these are just simple things like having positive mindsets, or, intentionally creating our surroundings so we can remember things that we like. So we have images of beautiful things that we enjoy. But some of it is actually a practice, and it takes a little bit of time to learn. But once you learn a mindfulness technique and a compassion practice that works for you, it can really help you, especially if you do it in a regular way. It can really boost your dopamine, and it's quite quick to go to when you really need that boost. So it can really be one of those things you do before you have to do something boring. So how does this neuroplasticity happen in the brain? If you're wondering, I'll go into it in a little more detail. Basically, what happens is that our brains are growing at many different levels. So in this slide, I'm showing you all the way down to the synapse, where the two neurons are communicating. Like Tim was saying, there's a synaptic gap, right? And so in this case, you can see that the purple neuron here has those red little dots. Those are like gates. They're like little receptors through which the neurotransmitters will come through. And with repeated practice of something, when you're using those neurons, you end up making a bunch more receptors. So more of those neurotransmitters can come through, the blue little dots can come through. And then not only you have more of them, but to make room for more, the entire neuron will expand. There's these supporting fibers that like stretch out. So there's this expansion at the cellular level. And then if you look at an entire neuron, they're like trees. They actually branch out as they are growing. So there's more room for these connections to happen between neurons. So now you're not just having a one point connection, but you have a ton of different points on two neurons. There's a bunch of different ways to make these synaptic connections. So again, with practice, you get more growth in this way. And then if you zoom all the way out to brain networks, now we're talking about how millions of neurons, they're interacting together. And so, you know, it's almost difficult to imagine because it's like this whole mesh of connections. They're like spider webs. Maybe you can think of a spider web, but really it's very complicated and it's many, many neurons that are connected. And there's this beautiful flow of information from one area to the other. And like Tim was explaining, we have specific sets of areas or networks that turn on depending on what specific thing we do. And when we're talking about neuroplasticity in terms of networks, what happens is that the information flow between those areas that's supposed to work together to let you do something, it becomes faster, the connections are stronger, and it's just a more efficient network, if you will. So let's talk about the networks that are relevant to ADHD. What happens when we get distracted and we need to go back to what we were doing? So we already talked about the default mode network, right? That's when we're like in the middle here, dreaming, off task. And then when we're really paying attention, we're right here in our executive attention network. But when we get lost in our default mode network, there's a whole another network of areas that turn on. They go, whoops, we are off task. And it literally like pulls down the activity on all those brain areas in the default mode network and increases the activity on all of those areas in the attention network. So it's a whole network of areas that are like a gatekeeper. It's like a switch. And the reason why it's significant is because one of those areas that are in the salience network that does this switching is something that manages our mind-body connection. So it's seriously like important to understand why mindfulness helps you in terms of attention regulation, because literally that part of the brain that is really active when you're connecting to your body sensations, that's a key area to make all kinds of mental shifts or switching from one mode of thinking to another. If you want to get away from those dreams and get back to your attention and paying attention to what you were doing before, you have to have that kind of mind-body awareness happening. And this is what is being trained when you do a mindfulness practice. And, you know, not only ADHD people need that kind of practice because all of us are compromised with our attention abilities during our lives. Stress, fatigue, aging, all affect our attention abilities. So this is why I like to tell people about the neurobiology of what happens when we're actually doing a mindfulness practice. And this is just a very basic fundamental part of mindful attention training, but almost any kind of mindfulness activity, whether it's yoga or whether it's a seated meditation, or maybe it's like a movement practice or listening to music in a mindful way, it doesn't really matter what it is, but usually it involves this ability to notice when your mind wanders and then bring it back to something in the present moment that is a sensation, whether it's feeling your breath or feeling your temperature on your skin or really paying attention to the way your hand moves. It's sensory. It's you connecting your attention, your awareness into your body sensations. It's somatic. So when you notice that you're not paying attention to what you're doing, pulling you back into that focused attention is this saliency network. So every time you set aside some time to focus on something, whether it's a mantra or your breath or whatever it is, you're strengthening that ability to notice when you're distracted and then coming back to that focus that you intended to do. And it's this cycle. And the beauty of it, I think, is that there's this sense of like intention and forgiveness or kindness around it, because you're doing this for yourself, because you're doing this because you want to strengthen your brain. So when you're trying it, you might realize that it's really difficult. So it might be very hard at first to make yourself even try it, right? So that's why I said earlier, remember that compassion practices are super important in order for anyone to learn anything, because you have to roll with the failures. There's going to be times when you sit down and you really try to pay attention and you'll just notice that your mind is really busy. Or maybe you notice for the first time that you really have a bad back pain. And those are ways that show you that you're more aware. But if you can bring in a sense of gentleness and kindness toward yourself, and almost a sense of like celebration, like, all right, here I am, I'm trying to do this, to do something positive for myself. And when I get distracted, instead of getting upset or judge yourself, you can intentionally say something kind to yourself. And that's part of the compassion practice. So some of the things that you might want to say to yourself when you get distracted, or when you feel like it's difficult to meditate, or it's difficult to do some activity that you're learning that's new, is something like, I'm doing my best and my best is good enough. And you can just pause for a moment and say, may I be kind to myself? And you can also play around with whatever phrase really makes you feel most loving toward yourself. You can just say something very loving to yourself, quietly within. Nobody needs to know. But the cool part about the compassion practices, and that's a whole nother talk to explain to you how to do it, is that it really boosts your dopamine. So when you start saying things like, may I be kind to myself? May I just forgive myself? Or can I just be okay with where I am today and not worry so much? And so if you just say these things to yourself, your dopamine is firing, and that helps you then to come back to your intended concentration. So once you, and Summer will explain a little more about how that's possible, but once you establish a healthy habit, there's lots of benefits. In terms of mindfulness practice, it enhances attentional control, reduces distractibility, and helps you have this cognitive flexibility. And that's exactly related to what we talked about, of being able to notice when you're in your default mode, when you're distracted, and come right back to what you were attending to, right? So those are the kinds of things that get basically trained. It also helps you then to regulate your emotions. You have a bit more of a cushion before you react, because you have a higher level of awareness, and also you're able to notice in your body what's happening before an emotional response gets overwhelming. And then also this part of the brain that I talked about that helps you switch between default mode to executive function, that part of the brain is the mind-body awareness. And as people have looked at in people's brains who have practiced for a while, that part of the brain literally gets bigger. So you're growing your brain with this. And of course, it reduces stress responses and helps manage pain and anxiety and stress, because now you have a tool to go to, where whenever things get tough, there's this like specific thing that you learn how to do. And I'd love to teach you guys one day if you're interested. You can get in touch with me, because it does take several sessions to just learn and to figure out what is something that works for you. What works for you might not work for other people. And there are so many different techniques that are available. And often people just think, oh, meditation is all about breathing, but it's not. There's lots of different techniques. And so the good news is that people with ADHD actually gain more from a meditation practice. They have more improvement than their peers because maybe there's more room to grow, but also because it's something that is really helpful for them, so that they really actually notice that it's better. And for anyone to establish any kind of healthy habit, it's really important to seek support and guidance. So I myself been meditating for a long time, but I still constantly go into a community to do it together. I seek out apps and guidance, and I like to mix it up because I like novelty. So I do all kinds of different types of mindfulness activities to keep me interested. I go into nature. So basically, hopefully, if you're ever interested in trying something, you're not going to give up on the first try because there's so many ways. And hopefully you'll find a support network. And a coach, for example, can really help you establish any kind of habit. It doesn't have to be mindfulness. Any kind of habit you wanted to establish is really hard when you have an ADHD diagnosis. So now I'm going to give the mic to Summer, where she can explain a little more about how that works. And she's also really savvy about explaining how that works in the brain.
Yeah, thank you, Vivian. And I think we're going to switch over who controls the Zoom. So how's everybody doing? If I know it's kind of late, maybe we need to stretch. I'd invite you to do one of those dopamine boosting activities that Vivian invited to do while I go ahead and share my screen to Zoom. Second here. Okay, can everyone see the screen? All right. So show of hands from all of you that are on screen right now. We've seen a lot of different new habits and practices that we can be doing to help our ADHD brain. So show of hands if you've ever tried to set up a new practice, such as a mindfulness practice. And keep your hands up if you've been able to actually stick with that practice. Yep, I know. I've been there. We've all been there. We know how hard it is to set up a new practice and to keep something going, especially when we have ADHD. It's hard for anyone, but when we have ADHD, it's especially hard because guess what? Building a new habit involves? Well, it involves deciding what you need to do, planning where and when for how long, remembering when it's time to do that, putting everything aside and focusing on the activity, managing your attention, regulating your emotions so that you can start and you can finish and keep going until you're done. And this is all very difficult because which brain networks do these tasks live in? Which one is the network that's so difficult for ADHDers to stay in? Of course, that's the executive function network that we've heard so much about from Vivian and Tim. So now, of course, we have this kind of crazy paradox. So we need our executive function in order to improve our executive functioning. And this is where a coach is going to come in. The good news here is that ADHD is the most treatable condition in all of psychiatry. So there are tons of things that we can do, including some of the dopamine boosting habits that Vivian talked about earlier. And then, of course, with ADHD, we also need support, outside supports such as all of these things. So many different things, of course, that it can be pretty overwhelming. And yes, these all help, but do we do them? Maybe. Do we keep them going? Probably not. So what we really need is a different approach. Because again, which brain network do we rely on for these? That pesky executive function network. So in coaching, guess where we go? We are actually going into the default mode network. That's right. A coach, a good coach, a well-trained coach is going to help the client to go right into that demon network and face those demons. But if we're going to go there, we've got to be ready. What would happen if a fire alarm was to go off right now in your house? You'd probably run out of the room and no one would be in their seats ready to learn and grow. So the first thing an ADHD coach does, or any coach, is to establish safety and trust with their clients. And I've got a story to share with you. Quite a number of years ago, I was in this really major life crisis. And what I found was that family was just not helpful because, of course, they were just as freaked out about the situation as I was. And thankfully, I had a best friend who just held space for me and remained calm and centered while I broke down. And the sense I got from her was, this really sucks, but I believe in you and I know you're going to get through it. And that's what we as coaches do for our clients. Because when that happens, when we believe in that our clients are naturally creative, resourceful, and whole, and are fully capable of making positive changes in their lives, when we listen calmly and regulate our own emotions, and when we acknowledge their strengths and act as their partner rather than someone who's there to fix something, then the client will open up and eventually learn to regulate their own emotions. So now what happens when someone is in a place of safety, then that prefrontal cortex, the orchestra conductor, can turn off the alarm and put the brain into a nice, calm and neutral, slightly positive space so that amygdala is calmed down and the other functions of the prefrontal cortex can come back online and start to then regulate all of those other players in the brain. And as a coach, most of my clients, they'll come to me with a lot of the problems that they need fixing. They want tools and solutions and systems so that they can be more productive, more responsible. And they want relief from their pain and their problems. And for the most part, they are focused on their problems. And in other words, they're coming motivated by what they don't want. And they come to us in this, they come to us because this form of motivation just isn't working for them. So yes, we need to talk about the problems and we need to talk about the pain points, but we don't want to start there. And this is where some of the neuroscience comes in. And though it can feel like it sometimes, coaching is not magic because properly trained coaches are using techniques that have a long history of scientific study from the fields of psychology and behavioral science. And now with advancements in neuroscience, we're starting to form that neurobiological basis to why what we do in coaching works. There are a lot of coaching theories out there, but one of those theories is headed by this guy. His name is Richard Boyatzis, and he's an organizational change theorist. And his colleagues developed something called the intentional change theory. It's one of the most influential in current coaching, and they've done quite a bit of neuroscience research to back up their findings. Oops. So going back again to what our clients tell us they want is, again, they're motivated by what they don't want. And these need to be addressed. But what Vyatsa says is that motivation is called a negative emotional attractor. And he says that in order for sustained and long-term attention to happen, this all needs to change to a positive emotional attractor. So what coaches do is we help our clients to establish that positive and compelling vision for their future. So we ask questions like, what do you want to get out of your life? And what does that feel like? And what are you spending your time prioritizing when you have that ideal life? And of course, these are really big questions. If I had to guess, I'd say most of you don't have the answers to those. So some of these questions right now. So maybe we start with just a little slice of this that's more manageable, like, what do you have to gain from a mindfulness practice? How will your life be different when you're in that practice? And what will you have when you're in that practice? Who will you be being that you're not being now? And where did the answers to these questions live? Again, that is our default mode network. So yes, this is where rumination demons live, but it's also where our imagination and creativity and our autobiography lives. And this is the network where modern coaching theory says that we need to be spending most of our time in. And in fact, we both coach and client need to be in this default mode network while we're in this creative relationship of a coaching session together. So as coaches, what we do is invite our clients to get in there with us and face those demons in the default mode network and try to get them to join us on our journey to becoming who we envision ourselves to be. And again, like Vivian said, some of that is all about coming up with new and better ways to talk to ourselves. And when we get into that part of the brain, when a person is thinking about their positive emotional attractor or their vision, what's happening is that ventral medial part of the prefrontal cortex that we heard about earlier that controls emotion and motivation and that activates our parasympathetic nervous system, that calms our nervous system down. And so now it's communicating with the other parts of the brain, and that's allowing for these positive emotions to come up when we're thinking about our goal, and that's allowing the visioning part of our brain to be holding that goal, and the areas responsible for motivation to be activated towards what we want. And then in that default mode network where we have so much going on, all these little demons and characters, we're going to go in there and we're going to explore what's in there and recruit. So we're going to be looking for our friends, like our strengths, like nice things we can say to ourselves. We're going to get curious about all the barriers that are in our way. And a coach might be asking, like, what is getting in the way? What are you seeing in there? What are those voices telling you? And what's your body telling you? So now we're exploring and we're trying to recruit the self-talk and the feelings and perspectives and beliefs and identity to just join us on this quest. So we're going to make changes in all of those areas where we see needing changes. And maybe these questions are going to prompt a thought to go down a different neural pathway than autopilot would have had them go. And that maybe that pathway is much more in line with the goal. So by exploring our thinking in this really relaxed, nice state, what we're trying to do is to get to a step 4. And that's the big one. That's in getting a client to an epiphany. And a little story about myself. I spent the first 20 years of my career as an architect, and how I became a coach was that it was the height of the pandemic lockdown, and I decided to use that free time that I had to finally figure out what I was going to do with the rest of my career. So I made a plan for myself. I wrote down all the questions that I would ask myself. I got books. I made a time and place to sit down and think about these things, and I sat down every morning. I did what I said I was going to do, and nothing came. Nothing felt right. So I put the decision on hold and coincidentally started to free flow journal whatever came to mind first thing in the morning right after I woke up. One morning, ADHD coach popped onto the page and it hit me like a bolt of lightning. And my eyes got big and I just knew. And from there, I made the phone calls I needed to make and I did all the research. I found the schooling, I enrolled and took the exams. Here I am today, and I've never looked back. And what happened was I had an epiphany, an aha moment when something just suddenly becomes clear and leads to a new solution or decision that wasn't there before. Doesn't always happen in a coaching session, but when it does, there's this big release of dopamine, and it's a really cool feeling for both the client and the coach. So in neuroscience study, this is an aha moment. It's usually referred to as insight problem solving, and that's in contrast to analytic problem solving. Both types of these problem solving comes through a really complex series of processes in the brain, but whereas analytic problem solving relies heavily on the executive function network, insight problem solving relies heavily on the default mode network. So now we can start to see why coaching can be such a powerful thing for those of us with ADHD, because now we're using that natural tendency to be in our default mode network as a strength rather than a weakness. And then once we've had that aha moment, now our job as coaches is to prompt the client to now integrate these epiphanies into their life and into their actions so that the new pathway starts to become the default and the old pathway starts to wither. So now we go into step 5, which is to get into action. And now is the time where we're going to finally come back out of that default neural network, use the saliency network to get back into the executive function network and move through all of the heavy lifting for planning for action. So talking about the where and the when and the how. And if we've done well in coaching, this planning is going to not feel as heavy. And in fact, it can be pretty automatic. I know my clients, so once we've explored a bit, just kind of know what they needed to do when they didn't know what they need to do at the beginning of the session. And so now that poor little executive function network, as it does its work, it's really supported and cheered on by positive words and pictures and a vision and feelings and heart and sense of purpose and meaning and sense of self. So now we have an approach that is whole person and whole brain, that includes the parts of the brain that we ADHDers tend to live in most of the time anyway. And I know it was a lot, so to summarize, the main points of our presentation are that ADHD brains are physically different in some areas of the brain, not all areas. It is possible to change and grow our brains in intentional and positive ways with practice. And an ADHD coach can help a client to recruit a lot of the parts of the brain towards what they want, including those parts that actually work well. So thank you for growing your brains with all of us, and look forward to, if we have some time, talking with you. And you can also follow this QR code to get more information. We do every now and then do presentations that build on what we have talked about today, and we'd be happy to put you on that email list. So thank you.
Vivian and Summer, that was great. I mean, I was watching most anybody that had their video on, and everybody was just like paying attention. They weren't like, walking around. It was awesome. Thank you. If people have questions, you can put them in the chat. Now's a great time if you want to raise your hand. If you have a question, if anybody has to go, we typically end our meetings, or we say our meeting end time is 8:30. Sometimes we go later unless we have an East Coast speaker, but Tim has already gone home, or to bed or whatever he's done. So let's see, we've got Eric has his hand raised, and so just a quick I guess context setting. Tonight we did a Meet the Experts backstage pass for for Chad members to join at 6:45 to hang out with the experts and ask questions, just chit chat. It was very informal, and Eric was there, and we had a great discussion about executive function. And then we just started talking with the speakers about, their experience with their own ADHD or no experience with ADHD. So with that, raise your hand if you have questions. And Eric, go ahead. I just had to look to make sure I wasn't muted.
Summer and Vivian, that was quite a in-depth, good summary of what happens in the brain in the executive functioning mode and the other mode. That was, as Beth said, and everyone thought that was a good description of it. I've kind of dropped back to maybe I'm oversimplifying. I like to go back to a thing we used to emphasize in the parent-to-parent courses when we taught them. We used to introduce the course, what is ADHD, tackle it. Maybe in another way, we weren't in depth as volunteers to go in depth with all the brain waves and the brain theta waves and all the which is active energy. But we used to say that it comes down to FID. I put that in the chat, Beth. Frequency, intensity, and duration. We used to say everyone, or pretty much everyone, doesn't pay attention. But when you make the criteria for ADHD and you do all those questionnaires and surveys, it's how often you are losing your attention. And when you lose your attention, how prolonged is it, right, where you're away, where it's affecting you, where you miss the lesson and you profound, how often and how intense and what's the duration, the length of time you're on and off topic and whatnot. I just wondered if you would consider that, agree or disagree, that frequency, how often you lose attention, how long it is before you catch yourself and come back, whether you might agree with that concept or whether that doesn't fit your model at all or something.
It fits
duration.
perfectly. Yeah, it fits perfectly. I think one of the major things is when you get stuck. So like you get distracted and then you don't realize you're distracted. So being stuck in your default mode network is basically your saliency network is not really realizing that you've drifted off. So it takes longer for you to come back on task. And then yes, you're constantly distracted. Like it's like way more often than neurotypicals. And so then, but it's not like a lost case because each time you get distracted, you have the opportunity to come back to focus. But again, gotta get that switching network tuned up so that you can, because you're going to get distracted. That's not going to really change. With ADHD, yes, there's going to be a larger or higher frequency of distractions. And the only thing you can do is to find a way back from there. But yeah, definitely frequency and length of time would be a great way to define that. And that's just because of that less strong connections between that switching network and these other two, the default and the executive.
All right. I'm glad you can say that coincides with what you presented here very well for us. Thanks.
Yeah.
Good. Just reading in the chat. Ah, that's a great comment. Shirley says, thank you for a very informative evening as a relationship coach for neurotypical women married to ADHD men. This material will be helpful in my work with them, which it includes in creating awareness and therefore deepening their compassion. Love it, Shirley. Thank you. That's awesome. Several people are liking that one.
Yeah, I mean, I can relate to that. My relationship with my husband has improved a lot because I don't get so mad anymore when he's not listening to me or cuts me off mid-sentence. I might still get mad, but
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
like,
it's hard not
okay,
to.
I can't help it.
Yeah. Vivian, can you talk more about the computer games or coding that you were answering Chelsea's question?
Yeah, I just actually met someone who works with autistic kids in education and teaching science. And they were just exploring the idea of, could autistic kids be better with communication and social interactions if it's through something that really fits their mental life, like computer coding. And so it's actually a cool area of research right now. They're trying to develop games. I think there might already be some computer games or coding activities that get kids with autism interact more socially. So it might not look like the same kind of socializing to neurotypicals, but it's actually what works for them. I have heard about it also in Minecraft and different places where autistic kids have much more ease to communicate through. I don't know if it's Discord or what I don't really know much about it. I just heard that it's a good thing for them.
Oh, Renee's got a question. Go ahead, Renee.
So I had a comment related to Chelsea's question. I'll have to see if I can find it before we leave tonight, but I believe it was at the online international conference, a session, somebody was discussing an avatar-based group program for teenagers, where they were in, I can't remember the name of the program, but it's kind of an alternate kind of world where you have an avatar, but you're there in real time and you're walking around and moving your avatars in space. And then when you get closer, you can hear each other like a real conversation. And as you walk away, the microphones turn off and you can't hear the other people. And there are some coaches exploring using that as a tool for a more safe, psychologically safe way of interacting. When they're not looking at people face to face or seeing their human face. And so then there was some opportunities to role play and practice social skills and things like that. So I completely forgotten about it until I saw your question and Vivian's response. So I'll see if I can find the information on it and get that to you, Chelsea.
Thank you. I'm trying to figure out what to Google right now. By putting avatar communication and autism, maybe?
Yes, well, it's like a combination too of like group coaching for teenagers, and so or a social skills group for teenagers or young people. That can be really powerful when there's more organic opportunities to practice communication, but where it's a little less threatening.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'll look it up, but yeah, I think so.
Thanks.
Yeah, keep looking, but hopefully I can find the name of the person.
Oh, I like Terry's reaction with the sparkling heart. Okay, let's see. I saw a couple other questions. I thought just looking. No, I think that covered it. Right. So questions or conversation about coaching for parents or kids or families together. I think that's a really good conversation to have. Vivian or Summer, as far as what to look for or how to look for.
The question is how to look for a coach for either.
No, for if you want to get a coach for your kid or your family or yourself and your kid and your family, should you each have your own? Should you have one that does family system, or What are the, I guess, options or things to think about when you're looking or searching for that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I know Tim does work with families. I work pretty much exclusively with adults. But I know that when it comes to families, starting with very young children, coaching the parents to be able to work with and help and live with their child can be a, a very helpful thing to do. And then often the family will get individual coaching for their teenagers. A lot of kids can be, it really depends on the maturity of the child, but somewhere around the age of 12 usually starts to be a good age where they can be coached individually. And the great thing about a young person being coached individually is that now they can step away and they can really start to grow their independence with a coach. I can't really speak too much for whole family coaching, but I know that there are coaches that do it, including Tim.
And I can only speak from my personal experience, so there's just one sample, but like we did family therapy when the kids were much younger, and it didn't really work that well once they became a little more teenage years, like even preteens. So, but that's therapy, so it might be different with coaching, I'm not sure.
I would say that if you're a parent looking to get coaching for your child, really keep an open mind and know that this is the child's thing. Because a parent generally comes in with needs, wants, and it's all because they love this child and they want the child to succeed, but you need to be willing to let go and let that relationship with the child's coach blossom, because that's where ultimately your job is to raise a healthy and independent adult, and that coaching relationship can really get that child to become that.
How about for parents of adults with ADHD? Have you seen anything, or, do you know if Tim does that as well?
Right,
When
did you say
you're
parents of adults with ADHD?
right, so
Young adult?
yeah,
Mhm.
so like my kids are 34 and 35, so sometimes I'll bring them into my sessions with my coach,
Mhm.
and they have their coach, and in some cases they've had the same coach, but it's one of those things where, because I'm in it, and I feel like we've been lucky, but I just wonder, when somebody's looking for that type of thing, how do you think about that? How is it different as the kid becomes an adult?
See, I'm trying to wrap my head around that question,
Yeah,
and
me too.
you might be able to answer it better than I can, because I haven't really been in that scenario. But I would say that, and you're talking specifically about coming in like
Well,
together.
when you're trying to, no, not necessarily together, but I mean, a parent, no matter how old the kids are, and I don't know how many of you have parents, but they probably still think about you and whether or not you're doing okay. And so maybe from that point of view, you could think about how you would want to work with a coach, and also maybe your parents could get a coach, right? I mean, how great would that be? Because a lot of people have undiagnosed parents who don't even know that there's a possibility that they could have
Right.
ADHD,
Mhm.
right? So I think if you don't have adult kids, you might be an adult kid of a person that might have ADHD.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
Well,
even if not from a professional point of view, certainly from a lived experience point of view.
one thing I do know is that once one person in that family system starts to improve, the system starts to improve.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And So the person who is actually getting help for themselves can now act as an example. And again, like I talked about, once you're in the presence of someone who is regulated and someone who is taking responsibility for themselves, that kind of becomes, especially the regulation, that becomes, it transfers.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Really good point. Does anybody else here have thoughts on that or experience with it? Renee?
I was just thinking from that perspective that, I have, because of the specific area of focus that I love to do with my clients, a lot of that comes up in relationships with family members. So dealing with rejection sensitivity, or dealing with emotional dysregulation, or dealing with educating other people because they've been late in life diagnosed and they're just now figuring it out, and they're figuring, so you relive and look at your whole entire life, once you get
Yeah.
diagnosed as an adult, and your relationships. And so it comes up a lot. So I think, for that question that you're talking about, Beth, it's something that often comes to my conversations with clients who are working on relationships and working on issues or challenges that their ADHD may be impacting their emotional dysregulation in relation to how other people see them or think about them, or what criticism and judgments they've received throughout their lives. And in some of these primary relationships, that shows up quite a bit. So that's the kind of stuff that that's some that you would come into and clients bring. But yeah, whether they're family members or other people would want to come into coaching, doesn't always go over well if it's like, hey, you need to go for coaching. Each person who's getting coached needs to really be invested in the process all on their own, but they can work on and get strategies and support and role play. How might they have that conversation with their loved one in a coaching conversation with me? So that's sort of, a way that you can bridge that and then gently share with the people in your lives.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, we're a little bit past 8:30. If there are any final questions, and if not, we can wrap it up. I think Summer and Vivian, could you put your emails in, or your websites, whatever you like, in the, if you haven't already, into the chat? And Eric's got a raised hand.
One more raised hand. Thank you, Beth,
Yeah,
for another
thank you.
night.
It's always good to have
So
one more.
I put in the chat. I know you noticed it, and Renee and Summer, and you too, Vivian. Again, I'm the coordinator of a small chapter. We're a year and a half old, Southeast Florida Chad, down in Palm Beach, Florida. On the third Tuesday of the month, we have a virtual meeting. Our format is similar, and you're all invited. You're allowed to be on the meeting and introduce yourselves. The first 15 minutes, I usually play a taped webinar from the Ask the Expert archives from the Chad National Office. This month's topic is once you set a goal, how do you stick with it? I found a nice 40-minute lecture. I usually play the first 15 minutes, then stop it and let people go back to it on their own. And then the rest of the hour, we kind of do what we did here. What are your questions? What are you concerned? What are our suggestions? How can we share? And at that point, you guys as coaches could be on the call and share what you might want to do in terms of your ID or a little bit of a tidbit. And, I moved the time back, Beth, to 8 p.m. Eastern, maybe hoping I could capture people out west.
Yeah, out of their
I
work
have a
day. Good
connection now
idea.
that the Kentucky chapter, I made a connection with them. I had 2 people from Kentucky last month join me with a couple of people from Florida. So that was kind of a good thing.
Thank you for that invitation. I see how that topic could really roll
Yeah.
off of what we talked about here.
Yeah,
I'd love to have that
it
information.
seems to overlap,
Where can we get the information?
I had my website there. It's www.chad.net, and then it's /chapter, and we're 131. So under the events tab of our chapter website, I have the link and the little bio of that event for
Yep.
April 15th.
I just put I copied put it
Yeah.
back down at the bottom of the chat for anybody that needs it.
Thank you for letting me add that in, Beth.
Oh,
and thank-
absolutely, absolutely. Summer and Vivian, thank you so much. This meeting's been recorded and it'll be up on the Seattle Chad website and on the Seattle Chad YouTube channel. So it's been a great presentation, and I'm probably gonna go back and look at it again, just because, even though I was here, because there was a lot and it was really helpful. A lot of terminology I hadn't encountered yet. Thank you.
Thank you so
Awesome.
much for having us here. We really enjoyed being here with all of you.
Yeah, it's been awesome.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of the week. And next Seattle Chad meeting is the support groups on the third Thursday, which will be April 17th. So hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good night.